Welcome to the most important week of the year for the podcast industry. Welcome to Podcast Movement 2025.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Houston. We have a podcast, Lessons Learned from 8 Years of Podcasting at NASA. I'm Dane Turner. I'm producer and co-host of Houston We Have a Podcast. And with me here today are Johnson Space Center Public Affairs Manager and creator of Houston We Have a Podcast, Gary Jordan, and Head of Podcasts at NASA, Katie Konans. Let's have you both introduce yourselves real quick. Gary?
Yeah, of course. Very happy to be here. I've been trying to come to Podcast Movement for quite some time, but my job has me do a whole slew of different activities around the country, including launches of humans to low Earth orbit. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm Gary Jordan, Public Affairs Manager. I do a lot of different kinds of communications on behalf of NASA, podcast being one of them. But I get to work with a wonderful team that does written products, multimedia products, and live broadcasting of human launches to space. And you know, we do all of these kinds of activities as part of our communications portfolio, which is pretty wide. We do a lot of different, we talk to media, we talk to the public, and Houston We Have a Podcast is just one way that we do that.
Katie, how about you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Konans. Really thrilled to be in community with y'all today. Thank you so much for just starting your morning and coming to fuel up on Rocky Fuel with us. We're going to get you a little caffeinated. So I have spent my career working at the intersection of creativity and strategy in the media space. At NASA, I head up our podcast program, so that's creative, strategy, distribution across our slate of original shows at nasa.gov/podcast. Please subscribe. Those shows include NASA's Curious Universe, Small Steps, Giant Leaps, Universo Curioso de la NASA, which is our Spanish podcast, and of course, Houston We Have a Podcast. And I'd love to kick off there. I think Houston We Have a Podcast has a really cool origin story. We've got a lot in store for you guys. We're going to talk a little bit about how our strategy is changing, how we're implementing best practices from podcasts. But I want to hand things over to Gary to talk about where Houston We Have a Podcast came from, because it's one of the best names in podcasting.
I appreciate that. 8 years ago, 2017 is when we kicked off Houston We Have a Podcast. At the time, the podcast portfolio for NASA was quite wild. Actually, the idea itself came from the fact that I moved into the city of Houston and commuted out to the Clear Lake area where the Johnson Space Center is. That commute took about 45 minutes. I was trying to find something to occupy that time to and from, 45 minutes down, 45 minutes back, and found that a free way to consume my time was, of course, podcasts. Naturally, I started looking at space to see. I was interested in space. Maybe I could learn a thing or two on my way to and from work. And I looked at the other space shows that were out in on Apple Podcasts, namely, only to find that, particularly for NASA, they were really just cut up videos, video products that they'd stripped the video from them and just put a random assortment of audio products out there. The branding was all over the place. The show lengths and themes were all over the place. And I said, man, this is not what I want to listen to at all. Why don't we just make one? And so I put together a pitch for Houston We Have a Podcast based on other shows that I was listening to. I love the interview format. I love that long form. And I thought it was a really good opportunity to do something a little bit more informal and longer, which was atypical. At the time, I think we were on the back end of Vine, where most of our products were trying to capture attention 6 seconds at a time. But here was this platform to have these lengthy conversations. And certainly break down the barriers of what people thought about NASA, which was really getting that behind-the-scenes look that I think a lot of people wanted. So we put together a pitch, started having these conversations, and it really just took off. Here we are, we're approaching episode 400. So certainly a lot of conversations and a lot that we have done over those years.
Well, you guys have been in the game for quite a while here. What is it about audio storytelling that makes it an effective part of NASA's communications efforts?
So I'd love to chime in here and say that, Gary, we weren't just talking about starting a new show. We were really talking about starting a new way for audiences to experience NASA stories. And I know there are a lot of folks who support brands or agencies, and they're kind of thinking about this as well. NASA typically, most of you here probably has a visual reference point for NASA. You see some of our visuals coming up here on the screen, and they are beautiful and iconic. But, you know, a beautiful image of space, maybe a rocket launch, a broadcast that you've seen, that visual experience that you have. NASA also has a really rich history of audio storytelling, not through podcasts, but if you think about some of the iconic phrases, you know, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind from Neil Armstrong, for example. There are ways that people connect with the agency through audio. So it's really about harnessing that, right-sizing the strategy, making sure that each of our shows was really tailored with a unique audience in mind. And then what I think has added to the success of our audio program is we don't just think about starting a podcast, we think about how can NASA add value to audio storytelling and podcasting. You know, what are the unique locations, experts we have access to, information, announcements that we know are coming out that we can really harness with the medium in mind, not ripping the audio track from the video, but really building for an audio audience. It's really important. It's focused on connection, building trust, building relationships with our audience. And today, our podcast vertical, we are one of the strongest performers when it comes to retention at the agency across our digital portfolio. So it's really helped just maximize our reach, I would say.
Which I think really lends to the whole strategy of why we did podcasts in the first place, which is that retention, right? It was one of the very few places where you could capture somebody's attention for a long period of time. You know, I was talking about Vine and social media landscape where you're really only capturing seconds. It's very hard to convince someone that of what we're doing and why it's important in a very short amount of time. Maybe you can give them a sense of wonder and awe. Katie, you mentioned the imagery, which we're very fortunate at NASA to have such wonderful imagery. But this was a way to really dive deep into some of these topics and try to and to an audience and to an industry that was willing to dedicate the time. I think that was one of the strongest things, I think, for this medium is just the amount of time that you can have a listener engage with your content. It's just building it in a way that you're going to capture that attention. And then, you know, why NASA has podcasts in the first place, right? And why don't we just kind of farm this out to outside of NASA? It's that incredible and unprecedented access to the experts that are at NASA. You know, 400 episodes, that's a lot of content, right? So we've talked with a lot of different people. We know the talking points, we know the stories, and we can dedicate that to, you know, to the taxpayer. The public absolutely has a need to understand what we're doing and why it's important.
And I'll add to that we really wanted to break down the barrier as well and allow audiences to really be able to connect with astronauts, scientists, engineers. I think Houston We Have a Podcast does a wonderful job at this. A lot of times when I'm speaking with folks outside of the agency, and luckily this has been shifting, but I would hear for a long time, you know, okay, the scientists, the astronauts, the engineers, they're up here, they've got something special going on, maybe that path isn't for me. It really allows us to connect directly with those experts and help you hear the stories that, no, that's not the case. There are twists and turns, there are challenges we face and we persevere. Everyone who has ended up at NASA has a very interesting story to tell how that happened, and we're the ones who get to share that with the world and really create a space where our experts feel comfortable opening up, where they might not feel as comfortable, you know, on a primetime television spot, for example.
You guys are talking about this access to, say, astronauts and experts and everything. NASA had a huge event back in 2020 with the NASA SpaceX Demo 2 mission. It was the first crewed commercial space mission for NASA, and it took NASA astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley to the International Space Station on a SpaceX Dragon crew rocket. It was the first crew launch for NASA in 9 years after the retirement of the shuttle in 2011. So how did Houston We Have a Podcast kind of use this as a jumping off point, and what are some of the unique ways that NASA is using its audio storytelling to tell these stories of modern spaceflight?
Yeah, that's, you know, it was such a monumental thing. In fact, the attention on that broadcast and on that event was really across the entire United States. Our live viewership for that program spiked drastically. We knew that interest was coming. First time from U.S. soil in 9 years. You know, in that 9-year period, we had been launching from Kazakhstan, human astronauts, NASA astronauts, but this was our return to launch from U.S. soil. We knew there was going to be a lot of attention. When we started Houston We Have a Podcast in 2017, we knew that there was this new audience that was willing to listen for long periods of time, and we started exploring and started with very general topics to introduce people to space. What is the International Space Station? What is Orion? How does space food work? Very general topics. Right around this time, we started thinking, well, we know there's going to be this incredible attention on this event for the United States. Why don't we make the podcast strategy tailored to the rest of our communications portfolio, to social media, to live broadcast, to the written products, and be a part of the overall strategy? When we really started honing on this, we saw an incredible spike in attention for our podcast because we were part of the whole strategy, and there was other communications products amplifying our podcast. So that really started a trend where now, especially definitely in Houston We Have a Podcast, I see it in Curious Universe too. We tailor the content to come out in a very timely manner with something that we know the rest of the agency is communicating in various ways, and we're just a part of that wave.
I love that, and I want to speak to the shuttle era as well, because this is a story I like to share. I am from a small town in Georgia, and I joined the agency in 2018, so right around the time where things were ramping up, right, as we talk about this return, this resurgence. And I remember hearing from people, my neighbors, people I went to school with, they kind of had this perception of, oh, NASA's still around, which seems crazy if for us on stage, for sure, because we know just how much is being done at the agency. But it was really eye-opening for me, and I always wanted to hold on to that perspective. And I think that with our shows, some are tailored more towards the space nerd, someone who's, super keyed in. Some are more for that first-time space explorer. I keep those conversations in mind, that there are many people who just do not know what NASA's doing today.
Gary, Houston We Have a Podcast just celebrated its 8th anniversary, and NASA's known for doing lessons learned after missions. What lessons have you learned about podcasting these 8 years?
I think, 8 years, we're coming up on 400 episodes. That's a lot of content. When we first started, I mentioned, doing these very general topics. And I think, right away, I was nervous. How long can I keep this going? How many stories are there to tell? Am I going to run out of these topics? Only to find out that, especially when we started trending towards, let's be a part of the wave of what's happening today, and let's make sure that we can use this audience to amplify the overall message of NASA, that really, it made it clear that there's no way we're going to run out of content anytime soon. So it's just a matter of tailoring it in a way that is specific to that audience. I think I mentioned this before. We're a part of the wave. Yes, we're a part of the overall communication strategy on what's happening today. But how do we tell the story for the podcast listener? And what is exactly they want to know? Katie, you mentioned, whether it's the first-time space explorer or the space fan. Houston We Have a Podcast is definitely the space fan, but we try to make it accessible as well. So it's just a matter of how do we package the story that we're telling in other mediums and give it to the listener? What is exactly the listener, the space fan, want to know about this specific event? Who do they want to hear from, and what exactly is that story?
And when we started NASA's podcast program, a real strategic audio program, we had a lot to learn. And let me be clear, because Gary mentioned this, we had a lot of podcasts, we just did not have any strategy. And this was a result of so many passionate people across the agency, whether in science or human spaceflight and engineering. They started their own passion projects. They wanted to connect directly with their audiences, NASA's audiences, to share the great, incredible work that they were doing. But it wasn't scaled correctly. So we had to have a lot of thoughtful conversations. At one time, we had 45 different shows, as Gary mentioned. They were all very differently branded. It wasn't cohesive. And a lot of you would probably be in shock if I showed you the Apple Podcast page for NASA or Spotify page for NASA at that time. So we had a lot to learn when it came to right-sizing our audio strategy in order to actually effectively make sure NASA stories were being shared with our audiences. And Gary and I, and Dane as well, we've been building that over the years. So we had to start from scratch on the strategy and really think about, how does NASA add value to this space? How do we connect with people? Can we bring people on adventures with our experts, not just have a conversation, but really embed them in that spirit of adventure and discovery that NASA's known for? We had to think about, how do we build and scale our audience? Even with a brand, and of course, outside of being a federal agency, NASA is an iconic brand and very well respected on and off the planet. And we had to really be thoughtful about how we were scaling our podcast program. But even with an entity as large as NASA, we had to grow our podcast completely organically. NASA cannot engage in paid marketing. And even though you have NASA Instagram, NASA, all of our digital platforms where we have tons of followers and people who engage there, as you've heard throughout some of the other panels at this conference, it's not easy to convert a non-listener to become a podcast listener. So we really had to get in the trenches on the podcast front and scale up, and really proud to say that we've reached 10 million listeners that we've been able to engage over that period. And so I will say that it's been a strategic success. And I think a lot of it has to do with the content and making sure we're adding value with the content. Keeps our listeners engaging. We want to keep you retained and coming back for more stories.
So we all love to check our metrics and see how our shows are doing. NASA's whole stable of podcasts is incredibly consistent in their performance. Why do you think that is?
I'll say that when we were approaching what is our KPI, key performance indicator, what did we really want to focus on? Across other NASA media channels, you'll see explosive numbers, right? Millions and millions of views on our, social media feed, on our videos, scrolling through. You'll see a ton of action there. But we really wanted to deeply connect with people. I think that's the power of audio storytelling. You build a connection. So we focused on, from the very beginning, retention. And how do we keep folks retained? How do we do that? We build the shows, we build the episodes with those folks in mind. We listen to our audiences. If you engage with our Spotify polls or comment section, we go through that and we use that to make content decisions. It's built into our program, which I think has made it such a success.
So I think the regular cadence of our episode posting really helps for the listener to understand a level of predictability. It comes out for Houston Radio Podcast, for example. It comes out every Friday. You know the length, you know the format, you know the content, and you know, hopefully, that is going to be a pretty interesting discussion. Dane, you and I were talking about recently this wave of we seem to really level off on our listenership. To us, that means that people are sticking around. They're waiting for the next episode. We have a pretty consistent list of our listeners, and that wave kind of spikes sometimes based on the content itself. Sometimes, I think we were talking about, it spikes in the fall during the school year and drops off in the summer when the kids are out, because we definitely skew a younger audience. So there's definitely ways to measure that success and know that, we should keep going because we know they're sticking around and we know they're wanting more, and we are continuing to engage our listeners. I will say, though, if you're talking KPIs, if you're talking a level of measurement that is a definition of success, one of the best, to me personally, is when an intern comes to NASA and they find my email in the internal distribution center list, and they send me an email that says, "Hey, Gary just wanted to reach out. I just want to say that I love your podcast, and it really helped me to set a course for what I'm studying in school and why I'm interning here at NASA." To me, there is no better measure of success than, we could talk about the numbers, and you're going to hear a lot about performance measurements and how to increase your audience. But if you can make such a deep impact that you you influenced a career choice, you influenced a path for that person to pursue a passion and contribute to our U.S. space program, I feel like there's no better KPI.
And let's not forget that our podcasts do not have ads, so I think that has a little something to do with it. You're never going to encounter an ad on a NASA podcast. They are completely free.
Well, as we look to the future of Houston We Have a Podcast and NASA's pods as a whole, we have a number of milestones coming up. A couple of big ones. The 400th episode of Houston We Have a Podcast. That's going to be the first Friday in September. And then we've also got, as you may have seen on our slideshow here, the Artemis 2 program, or the Artemis 2 mission, is going to be flying early next year, taking 4 astronauts around the moon. This will be the first time that humans have gone back to the moon in more than 50 years. So we're excited to bring those to you on the NASA podcast. And it looks like we've got some time now for some audience questions, if we have any.
Perfect. Yeah, we're running a microphone over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question around, you mentioned packaging a story to have higher retention, and any tips of how you package a story, like creative ways that you tell a story? Would love to hear that.
Yeah, I can start, certainly. After as many episodes as we've made, ahead of every episode, ahead of every time that we have a guest, we put together an outline. The guests that we have on our podcast are scientists, engineers, a lot of people that aren't necessarily comfortable in front of a microphone. So part of it is thinking about the listener, but then also how exactly to engage a person that's maybe not used to this kind of format and is coming into the discussion perhaps a little nervous. So part of the design of the conversation is really slowly starting off the conversation pretty slow and easy. We let, for example, for Houston We Have a Podcast, we usually start with something biographical. What did you study in school? Where did you grow up? What influenced you to pursue the passion and the job that you have now, as we work our way into the topic that we want to discuss? It helps the listener ease into the conversation, and it also helps the guest to kind of loosen up. We could talk about how passionate the guests and the people at NASA are all day. They're so passionate, they love what they do. But if you can relax the guest and help them to feel comfortable, that passion is going to come forward. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a way that says, I am passionate. You can kind of hear it in their voice. You can hear it in their comfort. You can hear it in the way that they talk about their topic. And I think that passion, if you can relax the guest and get that coming forward, I believe that level of engagement is what's going to ultimately retain that listener. People want to hear from the person that's speaking so passionately about what they do. And then working our way up to the meat of the conversation, which is, of course, hopefully something that is interested and pull the listener in based on maybe the title or description of the episode. They're waiting for the content. They're waiting to understand what it is, and we're slowly working our way towards the meat of that discussion. So people are sticking around, they're retaining because they want to hear the information, and they're engaged and locked in based on the passion.
Packaging is definitely really important. I mean, we're all trained media professionals, so the coaching is really key. How do we make people feel comfortable so that they'll open up, so that they'll resonate more with our audiences? That's a huge, huge factor in this. Also, I kind of like to think about the listener journey towards topics like we're literally trying to explain rocket science and astrophysics in a way where just the everyday person who doesn't live in the NASA ecosystem can understand and connect with that storytelling. So for shows like Curious Universe, for example, we will take the listener on an adventure. So maybe if we're talking about a story about exoplanets, for example, we'll invite the listener to imagine with us what it might be like to travel through space in a spaceship and see all of these weird and wild planets. And then we'll do a switch. It's not science fiction, it's fact. And scientists are working and actually observing exoplanets today. So kind of how do you make it palatable? Maybe you wouldn't click on an episode about astrophysics or exoplanets. I mean, I would, but maybe not every person would. So how do you kind of build that into how you're packaging it? And a real practical tip you can use is we have a segment at the end of our shows where, for most of our shows, where there is a Q&A element. We might have an external person come on the show. We might interview, another expert on the topic. For Curious Universe, we ask, what are you still curious about? Curiosity is a framework we can all tap into. So we might not all be scientists and engineers and astronauts, but we're pretty dang curious. So people stick around for segments like that. So just think about how you can kind of build that into your episode outline. Of course. Thank you for your question. Yes, Steve.
You kind of answered the question I was going to ask, but I'll come up with another one. My colleague and I have a podcast where we also interview experts. We interview researchers about heavy, long topics. So I love hearing your perspective on this. We also can't do ads. So if you have any tips other than great content for, I'd love to hear them.
I wonder if you can repeat the question just a little bit,
The
just
last
because it broke up on the speaker.
Oh, sure. Do you have any tips for organic growth other than making great content?
Yes, because we've had to get really good at this. So, I think that the number one thing is just show up where your audience is. And we know that NASA and our podcast do not exist in a science and engineering bubble, right? So we think about cultural moments. Where can we show up where people might already be looking up to the stars and kind of thinking and dreaming, and how can we invite them to dream with us? So a great example is for the 2024 total solar eclipse across North America. Did anyone see the total solar eclipse? You want to raise your hand? Yeah. So we knew that this was coming up, this huge celestial event. It's a moment, right? Whether you're into science or space, it is an experience where people will travel, they change their plans around just to be there. It's really, really cool for us all to look up together and experience a moment. That is a perfect opening to tailor your packaging around that cultural moment and make sure that you're giving listeners something they won't get somewhere else. So in the case of our NASA podcast, for example, we did an entire themed series on the eclipse. We didn't just release an episode kind of interviewing people after they experienced it, like ask them what it was like, but we brought on experts to help audiences prepare, knowing this major celestial event was upcoming. How do you get the best view? How do you protect your eyes when you're, trying to look up towards the sun, which we don't recommend. But all of these safety tips, how you can build your own, glasses at home or your own ways to look at the total solar eclipse safely, and just talking also about the rich cultural history in eclipses and how different cultures have studied the sun and, kept time and, track seasons through the sun. There's it's an entry point, right? But we can go so much deeper. So that's really key. It also, if you are pitching for, editorial placements with platform partners, they really value when you can tap into a cultural moment where people are already connecting and buzzing about something. And so that's a great example that I can give of how we kind of do that. And we look for ways to overlap. Gary mentioned the multimedia work that we do, so we don't exist in a silo, but we think about, are there best practices we can bring to our social media feeds, for example?
Maybe one more question?
Kind of in the same vein, I'm curious to hear, do you guys have other creators that you collaborate with in that same, curiosity space, like Minute Physics, or, I'm going to show my YouTube bias, but, Veritasium, Smarter Every Day, that kind of stuff. It seems like there'd be a real natural overlap of people who just really want to be in there with NASA as a part of growing their content, and then you benefit from their audience.
Yeah, I think so. NASA is very lucky in that we do have a very strong brand. So we do very fortunately attract some high visibility kind of guests. We have actual position at NASA that is called celebrity engagement, because what they can do, what a celebrity can do with a very powerful platform and of communication is reach out to a very large audience. And a lot of times an audience that NASA typically doesn't reach. A lot of times the people that stick around are the space fans, but maybe we can reach new people. So we've been fortunate enough to have guests like Shinedown and Styx. We've collaborated with other podcasts that's based on like a writing and science fiction kind of podcast called Writing Excuses. We've collaborated with them in the past, and I think how we do it and how we reach is maybe a moment of opportunity, but also trying to find a way to bridge with that audience, understand, like for example, Shinedown, their songs are based in mental health. So we've got an astronaut and a NASA psychologist on the podcast, and we talked about mental health and the parallels between a band on tour and an astronaut that's in space. And finding those ways to connect to brand new audiences has lent, I think, to a growth in listenership.
All right, we'd like to thank you all for being here today, and thanks, Gary, Katie, for sharing all of your insights.
Thank you, Dane.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so
Appreciate
much.
everybody showing up. Thank you.
We're going to be standing up here if you want to come in and talk shop. We'll be here for a bit. So thank you so much for starting your morning with us.